You are watching part 19 of the full series of Java Spring Boot interview questions. These are the 5 questions we are going to discuss in this session. How can you implement distributed session management in a Spring Boot application using Spring Session? How can you implement serverless functions using Spring Boot and AWS Lambda? How can you implement method-level security in a Spring Boot application? How can you implement server-sent events, SSE, in a Spring Boot application? How can you integrate Spring Boot with OAuth 2.0 for secure authentication and authorization? First question, how can you implement distributed session management in a Spring Boot application using Spring Session? To implement distributed session management in a Spring Boot application using Spring Session, follow these steps. Step 1. Include the necessary dependencies for Spring Session and a session store implementation like Redis or Hazelcast. Step 2. Configure the session store details, such as the connection properties, in the application's configuration file, e.g., application.properties or application.yml. Step 3. Enable Spring Session support by annotating your configuration class with @enable Redis HTTP session for Redis or @enable Hazelcast HTTP session for Hazelcast. Step 4. Spring Session will automatically handle session creation, serialization, and synchronization with the session store, allowing session data to be shared across multiple instances of your application. Second question, how can you implement serverless functions using Spring Boot and AWS Lambda? You can use the Spring Cloud Function Adapter AWS dependency to implement serverless functions using Spring Boot and AWS Lambda. You can deploy Spring Boot applications as serverless functions on AWS Lambda by creating a function bean and configuring the AWS Lambda handler. The adapter takes care of the integration between Spring Cloud Function and AWS Lambda, allowing you to develop serverless functions using the familiar Spring Boot programming model. Third question, how can you implement method-level security in a Spring Boot application? To implement method-level security in a Spring Boot application, you can use the @pre-authorize or @post-authorize annotations provided by Spring Security. Here's an example. Configure Spring Security in your application by including the necessary dependencies and configuration. Annotate the methods that require security checks with @pre-authorize or @post-authorize. Specify the desired security expressions in the annotations to define the required conditions for method invocation. Spring Security will evaluate the expressions and allow or deny access to the methods based on the configured security rules. Next question, how can you implement server-sent events, SSE, in a Spring Boot application? To implement server-sent events, SSE, in a Spring Boot application, you can use the SSE emitter class provided by Spring Framework. Here's an example of how to implement SSE. Create a controller method that returns an SSE emitter object. In this method, use the SSE emitter to send events to the client. Use the send method of SSE emitter to send events periodically or based on specific triggers. Set appropriate headers, such as content type and cache control, for SSE support. Register the SSE emitter as a handler method in your controller. Next question, how can you integrate Spring Boot with OAuth 2.0 for secure authentication and authorization? You can use the Spring Security OAuth 2 module to integrate Spring Boot with OAuth 2.0 by configuring the appropriate OAuth 2.0 provider details and defining the client registration properties. Spring Boot can handle the authentication and authorization flow. You can secure your endpoints by applying Spring Security annotations like @pre-authorize or by using declarative configuration. This integration enables secure authentication and authorization using OAuth 2.0 standards. Hope you have learned something and feel confident to answer the questions we discussed so far. Here's the list of questions that will be discussed in the next session. Please check out our playlist for more questions and subscribe our channel for updates and notifications. Good luck for your upcoming interviews.